Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Exvangelical Bible Study. I'm Sarah from Leaving Faith, and my co host is Justin from Deconstruction Zone.
Well, I'm glad to be here with you again, Sarah. I think we're going to have a lot of fun. We're still in the book of Genesis, so I'm
Which we will be
excited.
for a while.
I'm excited to dig in, though. I think we're starting with the Abraham saga now.
Yep, yeah. So we just finished chapter 11, which was the Tower of Babel. And so now we're into chapter 12, the call
Right.
of Abram. Um, okay. So there's a little like genealogy kind of backstory, and then God is directly talking to Abram. And um, in my text, it says, the Lord says to Abram, and then there are quotation marks.
Right.
Are we meant to think that like God is speaking to Abram at this point um, in an audible voice?
It seems to be the case. So, like, typically in the text, we got a phrase, vayomer in Hebrew, which means, and he spoke or he said. And we find this in relation to Yahweh all the time in the text, this idea that God spoke audibly to somebody. For example, it happens to Moses on Mount Sinai. We're not
Mm-hmm.
really given an indication that God spoke inaudibly at all. The closest thing you'll get is like when you start getting to the New Testament and it says silly things like those, the still small voice. That sounds obviously we think like our inner monologue is like God talking to us, but in the Old Testament, the God spoke directly to the people.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
You should be able to hear God. Okay. So, oh, go ahead.
I would say it's very clear in Genesis 18. And I don't know if we'll make it there tonight, but in Genesis 18, Yahweh has a face to face interaction with Abraham.
Mm. Oh, yeah, I know that comes up in your on your lives quite a bit. That yes, some people have seen God.
Right.
All right, so God really likes Abram. Leave your country and relatives and go to the land I will show you. He wants to give Abram a whole bunch of good stuff. He's saying, you are basically very favored, and I'm going to give you, I hear all these promises for you. So he leaves where they are. He's 75. He takes his wife and his nephew Lot and all of his wealth. So I guess he has tons of like animals, right? Like, okay,
Well, and
a lot of
probably
sheep.
slaves at this point too.
Oh, well,
Um,
that's lovely.
and the text does say that God blessed Abraham with this wealth, including the slaves. So they come up
Oh,
again later.
interesting. Yeah, my text says his livestock and all the people who had joined his household. Um, are we assuming maybe some of that was not voluntary?
Exactly. Yeah. In fact, what verse are you on right there? I'm curious to know it.
So that's chapter 12, verse 5.
Verse 5. Okay. I'm going to throw it up on the screen in the NRSV real quick. In the NRSV, it says, Now Lot, who went with Abram, also his flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support them. Oh, 12:5. I'm in 13. I never learned how to do
Oh,
math. I went to a Catholic school. Sorry.
oh
All right.
my God.
Here's 5.
Catholic schools are good. Don't do that.
All right. It says Abraham took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all the possessions they had gathered and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran.
Ooh,
Acquired.
acquired. Yeah, that's
Um,
such a different verb.
so they're slaves.
Yeah, well, I mean, unfortunately, that seems to be culturally the norm, right? I mean, that's what everybody was doing, I guess. So then they're traveling through Canaan and they set up camp. And then this is another time I think where it's like the same thing keeps happening over and over again. So, like I think this is maybe the first time God seems to promise stuff to Abraham quite a bit. and often like the same promise over and over again. So God is taking Abram to Canaan, and he says, I'm going to give you all this land. Um, do we have any idea, like, what was so great about Abraham? Like, why God liked him so much?
Well, it's hard to say because, like, in the story of Job, it says that Job was Tom, meaning he's blameless, he's without blemish. We don't know if Abraham was exactly that. God does charge him when he makes a promise with Abraham. He does charge him to be blameless, but we're not told that, like, up to that point he actually was blameless.
And he
Um,
screws some stuff up in the as the chapter goes on.
yes, yes. There's a very famous passage in Genesis 15 where it says that Abraham believed the Lord or trusted the Lord and it was credited to him as righteousness. So there's this idea that he was very faithful. And being that he was faithful, that was an act of righteousness in itself. But we're not really told in the Old Testament, at least, that Abraham has like these very special qualities. We don't really know much about him.
Okay, so God just picks him, and
Well,
he just picks him.
there's theories. And one of I think the theory I've always landed on was that it wasn't really important his character. What was important was that he was from the land of the Chaldeans. He was from Ur of the Chaldeans. And so remember in Genesis we've seen a lot already where there's like this commentary of like our God is better than the Babylonian gods and our mythologies are better than the Babylonian mythologies. Well, who better to plant the new faith or the new religion? Who better to be the forefather than a guy who left that corrupt society? He left Ur of the Chaldeans. God called him out of that mess and he brought him here to this land
Okay.
where God actually is. And so I think the important part of from Abraham is that he's been called out of these toxic people groups and God's making a better people group.
Interesting. Okay. So he has selected someone who he knows will trust him, like will be his guy, and he's going to pull him out and put him where he wants him. And now he's got his guy where he wants him. And now we're going to start a people group.
Yeah. And we've probably touched this before, but his name, Avram, which gets changed to Avraham, it really means the same thing, but it just means father of many. Like this is another reason why that these characters are fictional, because in mythological fictional texts they give names to characters that are descriptive of their role in the text. So
Hmm.
the early chapters of Genesis, all these characters have names that are describing their role in the text, which is characteristic of ancient mythology and oral storytelling.
Well, yeah, that makes sense.
Or it's just a wild coincidence.
You never know. All right, so he gets promised, God promises that he's going to give this land to your offspring. Abram builds an altar, they keep going, and then there's a famine. So it says at that time there's a severe famine in this land, which God has taken him to, but I guess can't provide food. And he is going to the borders of Egypt. And man, this is where it gets really weird. Really weird. Okay,
Yeah.
so he says to his wife, "You are a very beautiful woman. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife. Let's kill him and then we can have her.' But if you say you are my sister, then the Egyptians will treat me well because of their interest in you and they will spare my life." Okay. Well, and to actually before I rant about that a little bit, one one more verse and says, "And sure enough, when they arrived in Egypt, everyone spoke of her beauty. When the palace officials saw her, they sang her praises to the king, the Pharaoh, and she was taken into his harem." I'm gonna assume that being taken into a harem is not a PG experience,
It's not a PG
right?
experience and it's usually not voluntary.
Of course not. Abraham is like, look, I'm really worried about my own safety.
Mhm.
And what I'm going to do is allow you to be taken into sexual slavery so that I can save myself.
It's a little nuanced because
Okay.
my understanding with the story is that Abraham has the understanding that she's going to be taken one way or another. If they go into Egypt and he says that this is my wife, they're going to kill me and then they're going to take you. If we go into Egypt
Hmm.
and I say you're my sister, they might just take you and I don't have to die. So I think that was like the gamble that he was wagering right there.
Why go there at all?
Well, that's the thing. There seems to be, I mean, again, we have no evidence that he ever went there. Unless you read the Book of Mormon. According to the Book of Mormon, we've got these inscriptions showing Abraham in Egypt, which are fake, obviously. But the thing of it is that there seems to be an echo of Abraham going into Egypt and coming out of Egypt, possibly foreshadowing the Exodus event from the Israelites. So that's a possibility. As to the famine, here's the tricky part. God is in control of the famines. God in when Joseph gets sent to Egypt because of the famine, Joseph says, God sent me ahead of you because God caused a famine. In 2 Samuel 21, when there's a famine in the land because of the blood guilt on Saul's household, God sent that famine. So if there's a famine in the land here, we're kind of we're left to assume that either God did it or that like God was okay with it because elsewhere he's sending famines.
Yeah.
So does God want Abraham to go to Egypt? If he does, I don't know why he would.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of seems that way that, like, this is, I don't know, him going to Egypt is inevitable or supposed to happen or something, is kind of how it comes across.
Right, yeah, it's a really strange like event because it's hard to it's hard to know what purpose this serves in the story, by the way, which is another weird thing. If you're writing an ancient narrative about your forefathers, like why would you include this?
Hmm, yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
that leads a lot of people to dream up theories. Well, I've got a theory, so and so's got a theory, everyone's got a theory, but we don't really know.
Right. Well, that's fair. I think it's very intellectually honest to say we don't know.
Right. Right.
Well, and then it gets weirder because so Pharaoh basically is he gives Abram some gifts like I'm gonna take your sister, but here have some stuff. But then God gets mad about it, right? So it says, but the Lord sent a terrible plague upon Pharaoh's household because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called for Abram and accused him sharply. What is this you have done to me? He demanded. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? How does Pharaoh know?
So there's some weird stuff happening with like both not just this narrative, but remember there's another narrative when he goes to Gerar and his wife is taken again. Um
Oh,
that comes up later. Um Sarah's taken twice, by the way, not just by the king of Egypt, but also by the king
poor
of
lady.
Gerar. Al- Although in the story of King Abimelech, Abimelech doesn't touch Sarah because God prevents it from happening, which is weird that he didn't prevent it from happening this time. And
Uh huh.
we kind of glossed over it, but to your point, that you mentioned earlier, being part of the harem, God didn't prevent that from happening, and it's presumed that she got touched. So it's weird that God would be involved in one scenario and not the other. But
Mm-hmm.
to the knowing part, sorry, I got
It's
distracted.
okay.
Right. But okay, can you reread the verse for me again, so I can get it fresh in my mind?
Yeah, so we're chapter 12. This is 18.
Right.
So Pharaoh called for Abram and accused him sharply. What is this you have done to me? He demanded. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? So this plague comes, and it seems that Pharaoh knows exactly why the plague is coming. And I don't know how he would have known that unless, like, that God is talking directly to Pharaoh audibly too, or something.
So this is like a really good instance because this lines up really well with the Abimelech story. And so there's been a long conversation about why we have these two nearly identical stories in Genesis. And there's only very slight details that are different, like Egypt as opposed to Gerar, Abimelech as opposed to Pharaoh. But in the Abimelech story, God is the one who tells Abimelech what's happening. So that's how he receives
Hmm.
the information. Most
Okay.
commentators that are doing source criticism are under the opinion that this probably was just one story that was one event, but as different people
Mm.
groups told the story, the narratives changed, and it changed so much that some people started to think that they were independent stories.
Okay.
As you would, because Egypt and Gerar are very different locations. Um, but if they started out as one independent story, just this one singular story, then it's probably true that the way Pharaoh realized that he screwed up was God came to him in a dream or somehow told him. And the coming in a dream in the Gerar story is interesting because that's a very common tell that the story is coming from the north, from like the
Oh.
priestly or the Elohist editors. Whereas in the southern redaction in Judah, you don't see as much God talking in dreams. So a lot of people think that this episode here could have been from the Yahwist or the Judean source, and the Gerar story came from the northern source, which is why the details are different. But it's really saying it's giving you the same story. That being
Yeah.
said, the long answer to your question is that most likely it was God informing Pharaoh, but the real answer is we're speculating.
Yeah. Well, that's fair enough. Okay, so Pharaoh is like, what the heck? I love that this is like with an exclamation mark. It says, why were you willing to let me marry her? And saying she was your sister. Now, would the word marry there imply that, like, because earlier, 2 verses earlier, it says she was just into his harem, but if Pharaoh thinks he married her, like, that's a different thing. But like, I feel like that's implying like relations occurred.
Right. So this is very interesting, and I'm glad you brought this up because this kind of demonstrates like the deceitfulness of some of the English translations to try to
Okay.
read modern ideas in the text that's not there. So every time you see this, like it says Abraham's wife, it's typically there's no real word for wife in biblical Hebrew. It just is woman. So Isha in Hebrew would just means a woman. So when it says
Wait,
Abraham's woman, they translate it as wife.
wait. What do you mean? There's no word for wife?
Right. If you're a husband or a wife, you're just an ish or isha. You're somebody's man or somebody's woman.
Oh, okay. It goes in both directions.
It does actually. Yes, it does go in
Oh,
both
okay.
directions. Now there are some like in later time periods, you do get some words that are used to mean like a husband or wife that are not just generically ish and isha. But typically that's what you get is just this is so and so's woman or so and so's man. Um,
Well, thanks a lot, New Living Translation. That's what I get.
but to the point that you brought up earlier, he he probably did go into her as the Bible describes often.
Yeah, but I
Yeah.
guess that was not that important to God at that point to prevent.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that God seems to be very concerned with purity in Genesis? We get a bunch of stories about impure people having cursed offspring, like
Okay.
Lot's daughters being having a cursed offspring, the Ammonites and the Moabites, because of their incestuous union. And we find other stories where people are kind of cursed, like the lineages are cursed, like we talked about Noah and what happened to either Noah
Mm-hmm.
and his wife. But here it's interesting because if it turned out that the Pharaoh did have illicit union with Sarah, and she didn't get pregnant, it almost seems like at that point God would have been, I don't know, you have to think that he was like preventing her from getting pregnant because every time somebody has sex in the Bible, they get pregnant the first time. Like there's no word trying in the Bible. You know what I mean?
But I mean, that's part, like, that's what's the word I'm looking, I mean, that's like a big story obstacle that comes up is the fact that she is barren, right? Like, she can't have kids, and that's like importance that's coming up. So, I mean,
Oh,
maybe Pharaoh tried and was like, whoops, can't do it.
that's actually a really good point. It escaped my memory as I was talking about that, but you're right. Her being barren perfectly explains why she could have been with the Pharaoh and then not conceived. Um, because in the ancient mindset, if a man put his seed in you and you didn't conceive, it just means the Lord closed your womb. And in fact, that's what we see in the story of Abimelech. God punishes Abimelech by closing the wombs of all the women in his household, until the curse is lifted. So there's like women who couldn't have babies were considered to be like God was mad at you.
Nice.
Not good. Yeah.
No, that's not good at all. Oh, and millions of people, a lot of guilt. That's gonna, yeah,
So much
okay.
guilt and shame.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, here's this normal bodily function, and your human body is functioning as a human body does, and let's shame you because for something that is not your fault. It's fantastic.
In the ancient world, you don't really know why things happen or why things don't happen. You just have to guess, which is why they had all kinds of crazy beliefs.
Right.
Some of them more crazy than others, like unclean spirits were the cause of all sicknesses and diseases and whatnot.
Well, I imagine it's really scary to not understand how things work, and everything would feel so out of your control. And
Right.
so if you have these rituals and spiritual beliefs about all these things, at least you feel like you have a sense of control over it.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point because people very early on were already creating like incantations and rituals and ways to manipulate these mystical forces.
Yeah. All right. So they leave. They leave Egypt. They're traveling north. Abram with his wife and Lot with all that they owned. Abram was very rich. Oh, he's got livestock, silver, and gold. Look at him. Okay. So they go to Bethel, and there's another altar. God's very into altars. Um, so Lot also wealthy, and it says they couldn't have all the animals living so close together, so an
Right.
argument broke out between the herdsmen. So this is a lot of animals, right? Like, I mean, how can you like paint a picture of what we're talking about logistically for these two men to be traveling?
Yeah, it's a good point. So, I mean, theoretically, they probably had, if you believe Genesis, they probably had, hundreds of animals. Um, but part of the problem is like like when we are envisioning this territory, we're probably envisioning it as like being a lot of uninhabited land. And then we've got like just two families hanging out there. But there's actually a lot of people that are already living there. So
Mm,
it's
okay.
depicted as though like that we're in this open land and there's just not enough room for us, but in reality they're just in the land that other people aren't dwelling in because there's already people completely populated the area. um which is really interesting because it didn't really mention the fact that like it wasn't just that they would have been feuding with each other for land. they theoretically would have been trying to not feud with the other people living there, trying to find a spot to be.
Mm,
So they might have found a spot and said, finally, we got a spot we can dwell in. That's not already someone's not already hurting here, but then they grew too large. So we don't really know how big their territory was.
oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. So they Abram says, "I'll I'll tell you what we'll do. Take your choice of any section of the land you want, and we will separate. If you want that area over there, then I'll stay here." I love this translation. If you want to stay in this area, then I'll move to another place. So they're gonna divide up their stuff, and Lot is choosing the nice land, right? Like he's choosing the. It says Lot took a long look at the fertile plains of the Jordan Valley in the direction of Zoar. The area was well watered, it was pretty, and Lot chose that land for himself. So he went, and then so Abram stayed in the land of Canaan. Lot moved near Sodom among the cities of the plain. This is such a theme here. Verse 13, it says, "The people of this area were unusually wicked and sinned greatly against the Lord."
This is the
God
setup.
seems to, like, there seem to be so many times where people are unusually wicked. It keeps happening to God over and over again.
Right. Well, the my understanding here is that this is the early description of Lot moving to Sodom and Gomorrah. So Sodom and Gomorrah are described as the cities of the plain, which is what he takes. And so this kind of hinting, like the author of the story is expecting that that the foreshadowing is happening right now. So
Okay.
like if I said, I me and my brother were living in Las Vegas, and I decided I was going to live over near such and such, east of Mesquite. Well, we know what is east of Mesquite. It's friggin' Las Vegas. So it's like, if I remember my geography, I could be wrong. But anyway, as long and short of it is, that's kind of what's happening here. The narrator is setting you up like, oh, Lot's going to where the bad people are.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so Abram went to Canaan, and then God makes the same promise again. Um,
First time wasn't good enough.
no, first that wasn't good enough. Now we're here, and God says, "I'm going to give you so many descendants like dust, they cannot be counted. I'm giving you all of this stuff." And then he builds another altar to God. So, a lot of altars. Um,
Right. These are altar is a difficult translation, but is more or less like a usually a stack of stones that you could sacrifice an animal on top of, essentially. Um, so the god of the patriarchs was a mobile god, a god that was a god of the ancestors of the family members. It wasn't necessarily a territorial deity. So you can set up an altar anywhere you want to. You just need to stack some stones together, and you can build yourself a little altar.
is the assumption that God is going to come to the altar?
Yeah, so the assumption is that you can give libations and sacrifices to your deity, um, even as you're on the move. But we will find out soon enough that there is a territorial attachment to this deity as it's described by the northern texts, which we don't always get with some of the other texts. The northern texts seem to want this deity to be linked with Bethel,
Oh, okay.
which is the so Bethel, if you translate it from Hebrew, means house of El. So Beit means house, and El is the name of the god of the north, also called Elohim.
Mm,
So Bethel, the
right.
house of El, is linked in Genesis with God. That's why Jacob meets God there.
Got it. Okay. So we have a God that can hang out with you, which is fun. So now there's a war.
Mm.
So it says about this time war broke out in the region. There's a bunch of kings they list. I can't pronounce all those names. There's a bunch of them, and they're forming an alliance, and they're having some kind of rebellion, and it goes on. But let's see. Then, oh, this is really interesting. So it's describing like who's in this, and there's a battle. And as it happened, the valley was filled with tar pits. Well, that's
Mm-hmm.
fun. Cool. And so as they're escaping, some people fell into the tar pits. Oh no. But some made it into the mountains. Wait, what?
There's some stuff happening in this chapter that not a lot of people are going to pick up on.
Okay.
A bunch of these people groups are said to have descendants from the giants. Remember we talked about the Nephilim?
Mm-hmm.
A bunch of these people groups are descendant from the Nephilim if you keep reading the Pentateuch. And so it seems to be like there's this early narrative, even in Genesis, of like God's good guys going to battle with the Nephilim or the Rephaim. So we see that actually near the end of verse 5. It says, in the 14th year, Shalordomir and the kings who were with him came and subdued the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Kirnaim, which is really funny because we actually have a reference now to Asherah. But that being said, it said they subdued the Rephaim. Well, the Rephaim is a people group that were believed to be descendant from the giants. And so we're starting to get some interesting notions that the giants are important here. And in Deuteronomy chapter 2, it talks about, this particular territory used to be full of giants. In fact, it says that Lot and his family members subdued some of the giant clans. So I think some of these wars here are kind of like reminiscent wars of like, oh, Abraham was so awesome that he fought against the giants and won.
Oh, interesting.
But this is at the
Cool.
beginning of the battle where he hasn't won anything yet. I think they have to
Yeah.
kidnap Lot first, and then he has to go and rescue Lot.
Yep, that's what's next. They, let's see. The victorious invaders are plundering Sodom and Gomorrah, and then they capture Lot. One of the men who escaped came and told Abram, who was camped, blah, blah, blah. So Abram learns that, and he called together the men born into his household, 318 of them in all. What does that mean?
It means exactly what you would think. So slaves were typically born into households, and then they worked in that household, and they fought for that household, and um, they were essentially members of the household. If it was a member of the household that was born to like a relative, who would it be born to? Abraham has no children. So like it's not an offspring of Abraham. It's obviously
Right.
belongs to the people that he owns, the people that work, either work or slave for him. And uh and people might be like be taken aback by that slaves would be born into the household of these patriarchs, but that's not surprising. And we even get in Exodus, there's a law in Exodus that's really interesting, talks about this. This is referring to the Sabbath. It says, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, so that your ox and your donkey may have relief, and your home-born slave and the resident alien may be refreshed. The homeborn slave actually it says the son of the slave girl, if you read it in Hebrew.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's like a b'nai ha'ama. So we have like a very good precedent in the Bible that like these patriarchs and other people owned slaves. They had children, their
Mm-hmm.
children became slaves, and that was just the cycle. That's what happened. And I was okay
Can
with
we?
it.
Oh yeah, clearly. Um, and are we assuming that these women who are slaves, were they impregnated by men who like were working there who were also slaves, or are we thinking like these women were impregnated by the patriarchs, like
Mm.
by Abraham?
Well, it's strategic. So it's going to be a combination of both, unfortunately. And we actually catch some of that in Exodus 21. But so here's what you want to do. Um, if you're married and Abraham was married, then sleeping with a slave girl didn't always get you in trouble, but it could if you did a lot of it, you're going to have strife with your wife. Now, if you did sleep with a slave girl, it's typical that you would make her your concubine. So then you would have essentially second tiered wives. Um, but as it turns out, you could give or sell your slave girl to somebody else who wanted to make her a concubine or marry her. And you can get money for her. You can sell her. Um, or if you wanted to keep your slave girl and you wanted her to have babies, you would give her as a wife to somebody who's already serving you. And then whatever children are produced are your permanent slaves as well. Exodus 21 touches on this a little bit when it talks about Hebrew slaves. It says, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she should not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. So you can just buy a slave girl for yourself to, to be your concubine. Says he shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt unfairly with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as a daughter. So there's this idea that when you buy a slave girl and she becomes a concubine, she has some kind of a status. But if in fact that doesn't happen, if you purchase a slave girl and you just give her to somebody else who's already a slave, her status doesn't really change. And that is described in verse 4. So we'll start in verse 2, though. So if a male Hebrew comes into service for 6 years, it says, when you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. But in the 7th, he shall go out a free person without debt. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. 4 is interesting, though. It says, if his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. So if a slave girl produces offspring to one of your slaves, then those offspring are now your slaves. Those are slaves that are born in your household.
Yeah.
And to be sure, most forms of marriage at this time period was slavery. Women were slaves to the men,
Yeah.
which is why Genesis 3 says that your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you. It's disgusting, I know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's just no way to reconcile this with our modern ideas of marriage and love and equality. I mean, to say that this is the same God who has the same objective moral system and yet presided over all of this horror and was like, yep, do it that way. Like, it's just unreconcilable is the only word I can think of.
It is hard. Dr. Jennifer Bird wrote a book on this recently. I would recommend it to anybody. Called was it Marriage in the Bible? What do the texts say? I just picked it up. I haven't had the time to read it. But let me grab that for anyone who wants to check it out. Um, but she got articles written on it too. Actually, her website's got some short articles for those with a short attention span that can't read the whole book. But here is the book. It's Marriage in the Bible. What do the texts say? And so she's got a really interesting look on this particular topic. And most scholars agree that the ones that are still Christian, the ones that are still like conservative, they'll reach to ideas to say, well, God was reaching into that time period and slowly moving them forward. There's this idea that God has like this progressive morality that he's bringing them through. But this brings a nasty assumption, which is that like the people would have been too stupid to just follow God's laws if he said, "Hey, don't own slaves," or "Hey, treat women like equal to men." Like somehow they couldn't have comprehended it. But that's a silly hermeneutic to apply. To just assume that all ancient people were idiots. They were already doing calculus. Like they knew how to do advanced math way back in Sumer.
Yeah, well, and the whole like God gives all kinds of very specific commands, and it seems like he doesn't really give a damn if you understand why or not, you know? So it seems like he would be perfectly capable of saying, no, live this way. I don't care if you get it or not. Don't have slaves. Deal with it. Like,
Right.
it seems like he could do that.
He could, and he does something almost just like that in Leviticus 18. So if you go to Leviticus, it's really interesting because like God goes out of his way in Leviticus when he's giving these laws. He's like, "Hey, here's these laws that you need to observe, and you need to do it so that you're not like the nations that I'm casting out before you." So God is saying, like, don't be like the nations. Don't do what they do. Don't have these types of
Mm-hmm.
illicit sexual unions that everyone else is already doing. So, like, if he could do it with illicit sexual unions, could he have not done it with anything else, like slavery or treating women properly or anything like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a circular is not the right word, but it's such a problematic argument because if on one hand, I think Christians argue all the time that no, God had to do all these terrible things like eliminating entire people groups because he had to remove all these bad people who were doing terrible things, and the Israelites couldn't fit in with them because God was telling the Israelites to be so different. They were so set apart. And yet, that totally contradicts the other argument of, well, God couldn't give his full, real morals because he had to like respect the culture that was happening at the time.
Right. Yeah. Which it does not to be found in the Bible. And it betrays the fact that in Deuteronomy, when the law is given, God says to follow the laws forever and to pass them down to your children and your children's children and to write them on stone. And every 7 years, read them to the
Mm-hmm.
congregation of Israel. And every time there's a new king, the new king will make a list of these laws for himself so he'll know. And so we have no indication that these laws are temporary or they needed to be done away with or anything of that
Mm-hmm.
nature. It's not till you get to Paul in the New Testament that we start getting this idea that, hey, maybe we don't want these laws anymore, because society changes. If you've ever wondered if morals are subjective, the Bible tells you they're subjective because by the time the New Testament era comes along, they're like, these are shitty laws. We don't want these anymore. We got to get rid of these
Right.
laws.
Is that is dispensationalism the right word? Is that the term for like progressive revelation or whatever? Like God gives you pieces and yet somehow these pieces seem to contradict each other, but no, they don't really. You just don't fully understand it.
That's a good question. Progressive revelation is basically what you're saying, and it ties in well with dispensationalism. Dispensationalism says that there's multiple dispensations, like God dealing with humanity at this time period in this way, and now we're in a different dispensation, and now we're in so God has different dispensations in which He's behaving and acting in different ways. Dispensationalism isn't really popular anymore in theological circles unless you're like a Southern Baptist, but even like the big seminaries that used to be known for dispensationalism, like Dallas Theological Seminary, abandoned it and we're like, yeah, we don't, this is nonsense. We don't do this anymore. But everybody still holds to progressive revelation because you have to. In order to be a Christian, you have to believe that God is like slowly changing things in order to make sense of why things are changing, because they are changing.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is, they're changing because society progressed, not because God progressed.
Yeah. I mean, I guess on one hand, it's encouraging that, people are looking back on these laws and saying, this is bad. I need to somehow make an adjustment in my brain because I'm not cool with that. So that's a positive.
Right.
But yeah.
But check this out. Even if so, Christians really want to jump on the bandwagon of, well, the law's been done away with. It was nailed to the cross. Uh, that's
Mm-hmm.
great. You just made the slavery issue way worse, because in Christian worldview, God regulated slavery. Like, slavery used to be really bad. It was like this, and God regulated it, so now it's like this. He squeezed it a little bit to make it a little more palatable. Okay, so the law's gone. So those regulations don't exist anymore. Cool. We own as many slaves as we want. We can beat them. We can do whatever we want with them. The laws are gone. Cool. Like, so this progressive revelation doesn't fix these problematic passages of the Old Testament. All it does is you like put blinders on and be like, nope, I'm not looking at the Old Testament. We don't have to do that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't. And I mean, to the point that you make all the time is that, like, Jesus didn't say any of that. Like, Jesus didn't say, I'm wiping away the law. Jesus didn't say, I'm fulfilling it by completing it and no one else has to complete it ever again.
Right.
So it's so contradictory to say that, yeah, Jesus wiped it away when he so clearly says, no, don't wipe away a letter of the law, not like a stroke of the letter or whatever it is. And I don't really know how you get around that as a Christian unless you're saying, well, he was kidding. I mean, you can say it fancier than that, but you're essentially saying, no, he didn't really mean that.
Yeah, so and the passage you're talking about is a good one. It's the best passage for this problem. And in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says exactly what you said. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. So if heaven and earth hasn't passed away, then not one stroke of a letter has passed away, which is why he says, therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So, at a bare minimum, we have to conclude that Jesus thinks following the commandments makes one great.
Yeah, and telling people not to follow the commandments is bad.
Right, precisely. And he says something similar too in Luke 16:16, if I recall, about the law. About how it's not going to pass away. Let me grab it real quick. It says, the law and the prophets were until John came, since the good news of the kingdom of God is being proclaimed and everyone tries to enter it by force. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter in the law to be dropped. So there's definitely this idea in Jesus's teachings that the law is forever. And when the rich young ruler and others ask what must we do to inherit eternal life, he directs them to the laws of Moses.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think you have to do a lot of gymnastics to try and pretend otherwise.
You know,
Yeah. Well, we got a little sidetracked today.
I did not expect the conversation to
I
leave
know.
Genesis so so long.
To be fair, though, I feel like I mean, it's something that both you and I talk about a lot, and it's important to talk about. And so I think as we keep going through this, the law of Moses and slavery in particular are going to keep coming up. So I feel like it's always time well spent to reiterate that, hey, God was cool with this. So if you worship this God, you have to deal with that. in
Right.
some way.
I agree. There's a couple themes that are going to keep popping up in Genesis. Slavery keeps popping up. The giants are going to keep popping up over and over again, even when it doesn't seem to be a need for them. And illicit sexual unions are all over the place. So those are,
So, how big are these giants?
well, it depends. Some of the ancient texts describe them as being hundreds of feet tall, even. In some ancient texts, like for the Bible, for example, it says King Og of Bashan was only like, was he like 9 cubits or something? Now I gotta look it up. I said Deuteronomy, I believe. The How tall was King Og? So he was the last of the Rephaim, according to the text. And let's see where we get his measurements in.
We talked about him last time, right? He was holding on to the ark.
You got it right. All right. It says Og was king. He's captured in Deuteronomy 3. It looks like. Well, where's the? This is why I hate looking for the on the internet, because like it'll pretend like it's gonna give you the Bible verse you're looking for, and then it just like paraphrases it and doesn't tell you where it actually came from. But I think it's in
Oh man.
Deuteronomy 3. I'll just I'm just gonna type in Og in the search bar of my Bible and let it tell me. Because it'll tell me. It should be in Deuteronomy 3 though. Yeah.
Having a searchable Bible is glorious. It
Oh
makes
my
all of this so
gosh.
much easier.
I know. Could you imagine what people had to do?
I
Um
did. I mean,
mhm.
when I was in college, like I didn't have a searchable Bible. It was me like going like this.
Yeah, basically. So this is what we get in Deuteronomy 3 when it talks about Og. It says, "Now only King Og of Bashan was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. In fact, his bed, an iron bed, can still be seen in Rabbah of the Ammonites." And remember, the Ammonite territories that we'll find in Deuteronomy previously had a bunch of giants. It says, "By the common cubit, it was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide." So 9 cubits is pretty long. It's about 18 inches. So, I mean, well over 10 feet it would probably be. Let me do 9 times 18, 106. Yeah. So 13 and a half feet. That's his bed.
Yeah. So I mean, he's big, but he's not like a really big giant.
Yeah,
Just
he's not a little
like a
fella.
little giant.
Exactly. I mean, he's bigger than Shaq,
Yeah.
which is really big.
Yeah. So he's a big dude, but he's not like, you know, bigger than a two-story house kind of guy.
But
Yeah. Big
the
guy.
giants in the Book of Enoch are described as being humongous. Maybe when we talk about the giants next, they'll keep coming up. We can do a little bit of reading from Enoch, and there are other giants like that. So this idea that the gods came down and mated with humans and created giants turns up outside of the Bible as well. And in some of the old narratives from Mesopotamia, the giants are like 72,000 feet tall. Come on, come on, get out of here.
72,000 feet tall?
I know it's crazy. In fact, here's one in First Enoch. It says the giants were heights were 300 cubits. So
Okay.
that's like 450
Well,
feet.
that's pretty good. It's pretty good size.
That's a real giant. 400 feet
Yes,
is a real
exactly.
giant. What would you do? You're as big as their toenail.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, hide.
Here's the thing that I don't understand. If the giants were the offspring of the angels sleeping with the women, the babies would have been giant too, theoretically. Like they didn't, unless they came out standard human baby size and then they grew really fast, but then like their growth plates would have been off the charts. There's like, you're a physiologist, you know how growth plates work. Like the body couldn't keep up with that.
I think we have now entered the territory of like how fast could Superman fly before his bones disintegrate,
Oh,
right?
right.
Like
Of course.
I mean, if we're talking about 400-foot giants, we have left the realm of reality and we are now into the realm of magic. So anything goes.
The crazy thing is, like as wild as the Book of Enoch is, it's like quasi canonical. Like we find it quoted in Second Peter and in the Book of Jude.
Yeah.
In fact, in the Book of Jude, there's a quotation by name actually in Jude, like 113 or 14. He quotes from First Enoch and even uses the name. Um,
Oh yeah, there it is.
yeah. It was also about these that Enoch, in the seventh generation from Adam, prophesied. So he's saying that Enoch's a prophet. Enoch prophesied, saying, "See, the Lord is coming with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all." This is a quotation from First Enoch. So that's the book of the Watchers. That's the book of the giants. So according to Jesus' own brother Jude, the stuff that Enoch said was true.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Well, I'm, you know, that I maybe, I don't know, maybe this will be a better New Testament discussion, but I do think it would, like, I would love to have the discussion of how did all the books get in there, you know, and what's the decision making process on which books make it in and which books don't.
Right.
So maybe not for tonight, but in the future, I think we should definitely have that discussion because it's something that like growing up in the church we never talked about because it removes the illusion that this is God's perfect word. Here's a physical book done. But if you
Mm-hmm.
talk about the process of like, well, it didn't always look like this, and here are these other books that could have been in it, but they weren't. It feels much less authoritative
Right.
and perfect, right? And so we never talked about it. So I think that I don't know when it will fit in, but at some point I think we should have that discussion.
We really should, and it's a fun discussion. I went through a couple years ago and I documented on my website everything the first 400 years of the early church had to say on the deuterocanonical books. It took me like 6 months to document, but I've got a list of. So, anyways, if you ever want to know what the early church said about it and why people are fighting to keep these deuterocanonical books in the Bible, I've got the receipts.
Interesting. Did you make this spreadsheet just for fun or was it
Oh,
for like a class?
so I did. It's on my website. And so before I got on social media, I had a website where I used to write lots of articles for for the edification of mankind, and I loved doing documentation. So I know it's so bad.
You're the nerdiest guy I have ever met.
Yeah, I know. But
And we are all grateful for it.
so what happened was, I was watching a video. I want to say by um, what's the Sean McDowell? Yeah, so it was by Sean
That is
McDowell.
a guy.
Yeah, and the question was, why the church didn't, or why the Bible today doesn't have the Apocrypha. And he made an outlandish statement that I never spent a lot of time thinking about it until he said it. But he said, well, one of the reasons why is because they weren't accepted by the early church. And I was like, well, that's a lie. And then I started to look. I was like, okay, well, I mean, I'm sure somebody's collected all the quotations from the early church and assembled them into a book or an article or something, and like nobody did it. It's like okay, well, I guess I'm going to assemble. I've got all the writings of the early church. They're at my disposal. I'll see if they have anything to say about it. So I wrote an article. It's got like 100 different quotations from every early church father. I've got 37 of them listed here that I got quoted from. And then I even documented the first 4 centuries of church councils and what they said about them. And so, you know, I I maybe I'll put a copy of it and link it to the deconstruction cheat sheet. So the long and short of it
Yeah.
is, in the early church, they believed that these apocryphal books were canonical. And it wasn't until our modern time that people started removing them and it was like, oh, these aren't actually scripture.
Yeah. Wild history of the Bible. All right, well, we had better call it, or we will just keep doing this all night and we'll have like a 4 hour long podcast.
Pretty much.
We didn't make it very far, but next time we will pick up and continue the journey of Abraham and all of his adventures.
It'd be exciting. I think real soon we're gonna get to the part where he divides the animals and does like the covenant ceremony and whatnot
Oh yeah, we got a whole bunch of like God keeps making more promises, like
all the time.
promises the same thing again and again. I feel like I circled all of them. Lots of promises on their way.
Well, yeah, I mean these doublets are really interesting because, as we talked previously, you can take the doublets, separate some of the narratives out by north versus south, and
Mm,
see like, oh, they're actually they basically had the same tradition and they just smushed them together and tried to make them fit into
right.
one tradition.
I think they need a better editor as they're
I
putting
know.
them together.
Well, a lot. So my theory has been this: when the Assyrians came in and invaded northern Israel, and all the priestly editors and everybody else had to go south to save their lives, they had to mix with all the Judeans. Now the Israelites and all the Judeans are mixed, and they're like, okay, we've got like a lot of these shared cultural narratives. How can we utilize these narratives so that we can be a unified kingdom, have some semblance of unity? And so I think the priests that came down during the incursion did the best they could to try to say, actually, we're all related. We're the same people. Look, we have all these same narratives. And if we just combine these stories right, it turns out that we're all brothers and sisters.
Right, right. Well, thank you very much for talking about this tonight and for your expertise. I
Thank you for
always
having me.
appreciate it. Anytime.
All right, I'll see you again next week.
Sounds good.